Okay, we're going to talk about a serious subject, Prop 13. Let me give you a little bit of history of that. As you guys know, I grew up here. And when I was in high school and college, when you drove down the streets in California, they were utterly perfect. They were unbelievable. Highways, perfect. It was like driving on glass. Many intersections had flowers planted. There was so much money in this state, in the local level, because most property taxes were at 2% or more, and houses are worth so much money here that the state was rolling in the dough. Now, the bad part of that was it was just known that when you retired, you weren't going to be able to live in your house anymore because you were going to pay 2%, and the worth of your house was going to double like every 8 years, so there's no way you were going to be able to live in it on a fixed income. So people would sell their homes, move to mobile homes, move out of state, have to plan, work extra years in order to get money together to try to hang around their house. So eventually people got ticked off and they passed Prop 13. And Prop 13 says, it was 1978 when it got passed. It rolled back the taxes on property to 1973. And then it said it sticks there and it's only 1% plus a little bit more under certain circumstances. I think most of us pay between 1.14 and like 1.21 or something. Well, that has cost the state a ton of money. That's part of the reasons our roads look so bad. Our infrastructure's in trouble. So they took this to court. Prop 13 withstood the challenges. And so it's been with us and considered the third rail of California politics for 40 years. And yet, there's a move to change it. And there's a lot of information about Prop 13 you don't know about that means the world to you and your family. So I've asked attorney John C. Martin to come onto the program. He probably knows more about this than anybody. Hey, John, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Sure, it's nice to be here.
So let's talk. Did I get Prop 13 right? Do you agree with what I just said?
Yes, I agree with the history that you gave.
Okay, so we're sitting here today, and all of a sudden, it didn't happen, but last year, a group of nuns were working to change Prop 13, right?
Right, that's correct. That was the Daughters of Charity, and they supported a ballot initiative that would have made a significant change to Prop 13. It would have actually caused a surcharge for properties that had an assessed value over $3 million. And the purpose of that was to fund education programs and programs to alleviate poverty.
They pulled it from the ballot, or they didn't get enough signatures, I guess, right?
That's right. They didn't get enough signatures.
So it looks like they're gearing up for 2018 now. Is that right?
I don't know about the Daughters of Charity, but there are ongoing efforts to reform Prop 13. This was a unique one. Right now, what I'm seeing is a separate proposal, which is actually to separate taxation on business properties versus residential, so that actually the property tax assessments would be annual, reassessments would be annual for business properties going forward. That's the reform effort I'm seeing right now. So it's very different than what the Daughters of Charity were supporting this past year.
So it would leave residential housing owner-occupied, I guess, alone, or just residential housing open?
All residential, because for several reasons, because of the reasons that you just talked about. Which are that, hey, you have an elderly person who's been in their home for decades. Imagine reassessing their property taxes. They might not be able to afford their home. In fact, I'm sure many would not be able to afford where they live if they're in Silicon Valley, California, in a coastal city. But businesses, it's much easier, right, to get voters to buy into that because then they wouldn't see an increase in their own property tax bills. The issue is, of course, that what about all the businesses? If they suddenly had properties that they've been holding on to for decades reassessed to their full value, of course, it'd be a very significant increase in business tax.
What's interesting about that is that's a big rule change. But where it would make a difference, a big mall pays more money. Well, they're charging the top rent they can charge anyway, so it probably doesn't change anything. But there's a lot of mom and pop businesses all over the Bay Area. The only reason they're still there and still going are because the family bought that building a long time ago. So they can still be making, they can still be framing pictures there because they don't have to pay the current rate. So, I mean, it would change our cities. Do you agree with that?
I agree wholeheartedly. I think mom and pop businesses that have been holding on to their property for decades would be the hardest hit, but not only property owners, also those that are leasing property. Triple net leases pass through the property tax burden to the lessee.
Oh. Right.
And so you would suddenly have businesses that had been expecting a certain rental rate, which included some predictability on property taxes, suddenly have a huge increase in their annual cost of doing business. You would have to ask yourself, what would those businesses do? Would they stay where they are? Would they go to a different state? It's unpredictable. It'd be very hard. And I think that's really any tax measure when you're going to increase taxes. Yes, it's wonderful to fund these programs. I would love to fund most of the programs I see when you look at a ballot. I'm like, yes, I'd love to fund that. But then what would happen to these businesses, property owners? Everything is a double-edged sword when it comes to taxes.
I find myself as a consumer advocate really caught like you because I care deeply about many of these programs. I care deeply about people. But
right.
I remember when old people all just knew they were moving from their homes. And that's pretty sick. When you say
right.
You've worked and you've been here your whole life. Oh, you live in Palo Alto where prices are going up? Sorry, you got to move. Go live in Oroville. And it's like, what? And yet that's what everybody was doing when I was a teenager. I remember that.
Yeah, still today.
So,
and I think if reassessments occurred, it would be even worse. I mean, I have a friend who's a roofer, and his parents were tradespersons. He grew up in Palo Alto, went to Palo Alto High, and he said, I could just never live here anymore, even though he does very well as a roofer. But when you look at the population, you have people who've been there for a very long time, and then you have extremely wealthy people who are able to buy in at the current rates, but so you don't have as much of a diversified population. So it would become even more distorted if suddenly the elderly would be forced to move out of their homes.
Well, and it's great. You just did a great segue. We're talking to attorney John C. Martin. John, you specialize in estate planning. Am I correct about that?
Correct.
Okay, so we're moving now into the part that I'm fascinated with, and the reason we're having John here, one of the main reasons, he's very knowledgeable about all of it. So I go to my high school reunion, and it was interesting to me how many people there, quite a few, were living in their parents' home in Palo Alto.
Right.
Well, the reason they were probably living there was because of provisions added to Prop 13 over the years, right?
Perhaps if they were able to inherit their home from their parents. There is Proposition 58, which was passed in 1986, that actually allows parents to pass on their property tax basis to their children. So not only did they have limited tax increase each year while these parents were alive, but then they're able to pass on that tax benefit to their children. And in fact, in 1996, Proposition 193 also allows grandparents to pass on their property tax basis to grandchildren. Of course, the children have to be deceased for that to be the case. So some significant benefits, which when combined with Prop 13, can allow children to stay in these homes that are passed on to them.
I'm Michael Finney. This is Consumer Talk. We're talking to attorney John C. Martin about Prop 13. We're going to continue this conversation after this.
KGO.
Welcome back to Consumer Talk on the next generation of KGO. I'm Michael Finney. We're talking about Prop 13. Prop 13 is a law that prescribes how you pay taxes. It changed everything back in 1978. It's considered the third rail of California politics, and now people are talking about changing it. We went we've gone over that recently. On the live line is a state attorney, John C. Martin. He's out of Midlow Park. He's very knowledgeable on this. So, by the way, we're getting a ton of calls, and I'm being texted by friends of mine, too, all educators, pointing out that Prop 13 devastated schools. Yes, they did. I'm not trying to, I'm not picking a side on Prop 13. I'm just talking about what occurred and how back in the day, because pre-Prop 13, many retired people, you just assumed you had to sell your house and move because property values move so quick in California that if you're not earning a current salary that's keeping up with inflation, there's no way you can afford to pay the old property taxes of about 2%. So now they're closer to 1%, and they freeze. That's the other thing I don't think I pointed out, that once you figure out what your property taxes are, they can only go up. John, how much can they go up a year? It's like 1% of what you're currently paying. Is that right?
No, it's 2% each year, which is just slightly below what inflation has been over the last several decades.
So people that own their home in 1978 are still paying like $1,000 or even less in property taxes a year, whereas their neighbor next door will be paying, $1 million home or a $2 million home in Palo Alto, let's say. They'd be paying about 23 or 24 grand a year, right?
That's right. You'd look at what the person who bought in 78 paid for their home and then increased by 2% each year going forward. But the person who just bought in would be paying at a much higher rate. And so you've indirectly leveled the greatest criticism of Prop 13, which is that there's an inequity between the person who recently bought and the person who's held on for a very long time. To a certain extent, that sounds very unfair. On the other hand, it comes down to predictability, that the person who bought 30, 40 years ago, their property taxes are higher, and they've been able to factor in with their savings, with the way that they spend, what their increase over their lifetime in property taxes will be. So it's hard to say that it's fair or unfair. It's both.
Yeah, good point. This went to the Supreme Court, and they used two pictures of a house, one a little tiny house, and one this gigantic mansion. I think the little tiny house was just in a normal neighborhood, and the big house was in Beverly Hills, and they paid the exact same amount in taxes. And they were saying, how fair is this? And the Supreme Court said, fine with us. And so that's the court challenges didn't work. So now people are looking at whether or not we should change the law. I'll leave that to all of our listeners to make a decision on who wants to do it. But here's the deal, and John, I'll have you comment on this.
Sure.
Everybody hates it when you're the new buyer. 10 years later, you like the law.
Right. Yeah, and it's funny because these new buyers, they're eventually going to get older. And eventually, they may be living on a fixed income too, and so that's going to be, we're going to be turning the tables around at that point. Look, I think that Prop 13 does distort markets, and I think one of the things you didn't mention is that we actually have a very limited supply of housing units available on the market. That's one of the reasons why property values are increasing so quickly. So one argument is, hey, if we abolished Prop 13, we'd actually see property values come down significantly. And the reason for that is because of an increase in supply on the market, that all of a sudden people would be incentivized to sell their homes because the property taxes are going up, right? And that may actually bring down the cost of housing. More and more, we're living in a renter society in California. Do we want to incentivize people to be able to own, but also to be able to sell very easily? So that's also an argument. Maybe this would be better to allow the market to operate without as much distortion.
That's how complex this issue is,
right?
And we invite everybody to take one side or the other, because people are what you said earlier about one of the main critiques of this is should residential property, owner-occupied property, be treated the same as business properties? And so that's normally, when there are moves to change things, it's to separate those two. So we'll see if that happens. Everybody can pick their own side of this. But one thing I want to talk about, and I've only got 5 minutes left with you here, John, I want to make sure everybody knows this. What's interesting about Prop 13, and you touched on it, but that you can hand it down to your children.
Right.
Even if they can't afford to buy your whole house, right? I mean, explain all those rules.
Right. The voters decided that it would not be a change in ownership if your children purchased or were given your property. And that is a very powerful tool. You could sell your home to your children, and there would be no reassessment for property taxes, or leave it to them. And there's a lot of exceptions and rules, regarding that. It's just a primary residence, but it doesn't matter what the value could be. You could have $100 million worth residence that's worth $100 million. Doesn't matter what the value is. You can pass that on to your children with no reassessment for property taxes, plus the first $1 million in assessed value of all other real property, which could be commercial property as well. And if you are guessing, hey, people have been taking advantage of that, yes, absolutely. And there's a whole industry behind that in helping people reduce or eliminate increase in property tax.
Now, the other thing a lot of people don't know is once you're 55, you can move and keep your taxes if you follow the rules. Keep your Prop 13 old taxes. So, for instance, you could inherit a home from your parents or grandparents. It could be a $2 million home. Your taxes would be about $1,000 a year, and you can pick up, sell that home, move to another one, and keep the taxes, right?
That's correct in general, and it would have to be in the same county, or there are other counties that have agreements amongst themselves to allow you to transfer the property tax basis. But yes, you have to be over 55 to take advantage of that.
And so people can downsize. So if you have a big house in Professorville, you could move to a smaller condominium somewhere, pocket some cash, and keep your old taxes, right?
It's possible, yes.
Wow. Okay. Now let's talk about, so a lot of people will inherit a house from their family, from their parents, or buy it, but let's say inherit it, and you got two siblings. One of them can afford it, the other one can't. Can you split the Prop 13 advantage?
All right. Well, this is one of the biggest hazards with the parent-to-child exception from reassessment. Is sure you can leave a home to two children, and they would qualify for the parent-to-child exception from reassessment. But what two children can share that home? Is one going to live on one side of the home and the other's going to live on the other? So often siblings will say, "Well, I'll buy you out." But unfortunately, there's no sibling-to-sibling exception from reassessment. So that buyout would cause a partial reassessment if there's two siblings, 50% of the property. There are some tools that people can use. For example, when they're doing their estate planning, they could decide just in the documents that they draft that one child gets the home, the other gets cash. The problem is it's hard to value what it will be at the time of your death. You have no idea what the value will be of your home at your death. Another is upon your death, if a third-party loan is obtained that cashes out one child, and then the other child receives the encumbered residence, then that one child who receives the residence can get the benefit of a parent-to-child transfer. Although I have seen local counties, in many cases, nitpick about the formalities. So it's important for individuals to tread very carefully when they're taking advantage of that exception.
When it comes to Prop 13 and any exchange or inheritance, you need to get with an attorney or you can blow it. And an attorney, an estate planner like John C. Martin, that actually understands all of this. Make sure they understand it. When I was looking around online, I saw a lot of really bad advice about Prop 13. Do you hear a lot of bad advice, John?
Well, I indirectly, in that I've had clients come to me who perhaps their parents set up an estate planning document which was drafted by an attorney and unfortunately was not able to give them the relief they needed. So in that way, yes, I'm seeing the fruits of that bad advice.
John C. Martin, estate planning attorney in Menlo Park. John, I really appreciate your time today. You were enlightening.
Thanks so much. Have a good one.
Thank you. You too. Hey, let's bring on two people real quick. I'm going to talk to Peter and Dawn because I really feel like they need to chime in here because I've asked people to. Peter in Castro Valley, you only get about 3 lines because I got to run, but I want you to have your say. Go ahead, Peter.
Hi, thanks for letting me on.
Sure.
There's always two sides to the story, but as an educator for the past 20 years, I can tell you that if there's 6 million students in California, there's 10,000 schools. Me as a principal, I don't know what kind of budget I'm going to have until May of the year before the following school year, and then I don't even get it till September. So we're laying off staff, hiring staff. If and this is for schools with 500, 3,000 kids, over 200 employees. If you had to run any business that way, it would be crazy, and that's one of the problems with education today.
I agree. Prop 13 made your job so tough. The politicians have not come up with a plan 40 years later on how we're going to deal with this. And by the way, Peter, I'm really glad you called because it really ticks me off when people say we ought to run government like business, but then they don't give you managers the tools you need. It's unbelievable.
Thank you so much for saying that.
Peter, I appreciate it. I'm going to run. I just wanted you to be able to have your say. And then in Sonol, we've got Don. Don, I want you to have your say real quick, too. Go ahead, buddy.
Hi, Mike. You got a great program. You've helped out my family before. So real quick, it wasn't just retirees who were worried about being taxed out of their house in the 70s. I remember the talk around the dinner table at my family's house in 1978, 77 even, was my parents were worried about being taxed out of their house because housing prices were going up so fast, as well as county assessors had no limit as to how much they could assess property for. They had no reins on them whatsoever. And if I recall correctly, the tax rate at that time was 3% of assessed value, not 2%.
Yeah, Don, you could easily be right on that. You could be right on that. Yeah.
One last quick thing, if I may. I work in the mortgage industry. I am not presently a property owner, but I do tell new property owners that Prop 13 protects you because the rate used to be 3%. And now you're paying, 1.25%, actually closer to 1.3 now with special assessments. But it does protect new buyers as well. They just have to get their resentment over, past the guy who bought it 3 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Don, I appreciate you calling in. Thanks a lot. That's how complicated Prop 13 is. You have people like Don and Peter that are dealing with it every day. They understand. And John C. Martin dealing with it every day. So this is going to come before you on a ballot, I think. I think you're going to start hearing a lot about it. I just wanted to set the tone and let you know also you can make Prop 13 work for you and your family. So before you buy or sell a home, talk to an attorney.